The book of Genesis, what's the first event there?
Creation.
Yeah, Adam and Eve. And just not on your sheet there, where are they prominent? What chapters? Where are Adam and Eve? 1 through 3. Okay. Whoop. That was a fancy one. 1 through 3. Okay. What's the last? Who's the last major character in Genesis? Joseph, yeah. And so where does the Joseph, and this goes along with our outline, where's the Joseph story start? What chapter?
37, 38.
Great, 37. And what's the last chapter of Genesis? And
50.
Joseph is still, 50. And Joseph is still alive. He said, don't leave my bones here. You'll go back into the promised land. Original audience, Moses at Mount Sinai. He's convincing the people they belong in the promised land, not in Egypt. And he includes that detail at the end of Joseph's life. He says to his brothers, don't leave my bones here in Egypt. But when you go back to the promised land, take my bones and bury them next to my father, Abraham and Isaac. Because that's our land. Okay. So good. So that's the frame of the book of Genesis. You got Adam and Eve, of course, but then Joseph. Okay, and now think about that. That sets us up for Exodus, but we've got 400 years or more there between Joseph and the front of Exodus. What's the so that's Genesis. What's the first event going on roughly out of your choices there in Exodus? Where does that start? Yeah, Moses' birth. And so really chapter 1 chapter 1 is really about Pharaoh and killing the babies there. That's really where it starts, and Moses comes into that context.
Chapter 1, is that just the first attempt at killing babies, and then when Moses is born, it goes into...
Yeah, I think Moses either clips the end of chapter 1 or starts chapter 2. No, he starts chapter 2.
Right, so the second attempt at killing babies is in chapter 2, right? Because Pharaoh basically commissions the midwives to kill the babies.
Yeah,
first.
so it's an ongoing thing.
Okay.
Right, so between chapter 1 and chapter 2, you've got this ongoing thing. So Pharaoh, he doesn't know Joseph. Okay, so that's our tie. This new Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph. By the way, how do you say this? Moses' birth. How do you say this? No. There are 2 S's here. This is Moses' birth. This is not Moses' birth. There is no S here.
I see the confusion.
Okay.
It's
So
plural,
just you're welcome. You're welcome. And while we're at it, stop talking.
I'm just making it up as I go.
While we're at it, don't say that. How do you say this word?
Jesus.
Jesus. How many S's are in this?
2.
2 S's. There is no S there. Okay. Now, it's become popular in the last 15 years to say Jesus is, and actually it's gone into print that people put up an apostrophe S after this.
Wow.
Now, in fairness, so just, you're welcome for all this. But there are only 2 S's there. So Jesus' birth, Moses' birth. Now, as an English major, I studied this, and there is confusion on this, and this is why. And so if you go to different grammar books, which I have done, I own grammar books, and when I see a grammar book that I don't own, I go to this and see what they say. And there's variance on this. Basically, it goes down to this. If you have 2 S sounds in the last 2 syllables, you don't add another S. It's just too hard to say. So you don't say Jesus is. Jesus is. Or you don't say Moses is. And it's just kind of a practical rule. The other rule that's pretty firm is when you have a name in antiquity, like Oedipus, typically a Greek name, that ends in S, preceded by a vowel sound. So Oedipus, U-S. You don't add an additional S. Okay? So anyway, you're not in sin. If you add an S that's not there, you're just wrong. But it is popular today, especially among the young who haven't been taught grammar, to say Jesus is there. And it's very popular. Like, you probably hear it all the time in RUF. I mean, I hear it from RUF people all the time because they're young. Yeah. But you're not in sin for saying Jesus is. You're just wasting your breath. Okay.
I can see why foreigners hate learning English.
Yeah.
Essentially what you said the rule was,
It disappears for practical reasons.
Well, they'll say, well, why don't I add an S? And you're like, well, it's just too hard, so we decided to stop.
That's right. Yeah. It is that. And that's why the grammar books split on, like, when you only have one S at the end, like Oedipus. There's only one S in that word, but the S ends the word, and it's preceded by a vowel. It just sounds like you're going, you know, when you say Oedipus's father.
Oedipus, if you have multiple, it'd be Oedipus.
That's right. Okay, back to stuff that matters. Okay, Moses' birth is the first event of Exodus. What's the last event of Exodus?
The tabernacle.
Yeah, the tabernacle construction. And so tabernacle construction completes. The glory of God descends on the tabernacle. The glory cloud fills the tabernacle, you know, like the pillar of cloud, but it all fills the tabernacle, so much so that the priest can't go into the tabernacle to minister for a while. And that's how Exodus ends. So let me get this on here. So Moses' birth is really, that's chapter 2. So tabernacle, I'll just put, instead of construction, I'll put complete. And how many chapters in Exodus? What's our last Exodus chapter? It's also even, but it's not as long as Genesis. How's that for a hint? 40, yeah. Okay, so Exodus 40 is tabernacle construction. So you can, you know, if you just get this frame in your head, that's helpful for you to know what's in these books. Tabernacle construction, they finished that thing at the base of Mount Sinai. Okay, that's where they are, and then they start traveling. They travel with the tabernacle. That's why it's a tabernacle instead of a temple, because it's mobile. It's a mobile temple. Okay, and so you got canvas instead of stone. Canvas and frames.
Somebody invented the first mobile plan.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So everything in between here. So you've got, you know, all the 10 plagues. You know, Moses goes into Midian. Moses is in Egypt. He goes into Midian. He comes back from Midian after, how long is he in Midian?
40 years.
Yeah, how long had he been in Egypt before that?
40 years.
How long did he wander in the wilderness before he died?
40 years.
Okay, there you go. Moses' life, 120 years. So, by the way, antiquity, that's common. We have, in older days, people lasted longer if they didn't die in war. And so we've got all these records from all these various ancient cultures that record the length of their king's reign, and it's these very lengthy years.
That's impossible. Science is a new thing.
And we wonder if it's well, no. Yeah, Moses comes back. You got 10 plagues. You got the Exodus from Egypt. and then they get out from Egypt, and what miracle do they need from God immediately?
Red Sea.
Red Sea. So they cross the Red Sea, and then on their way to Sinai, they get hungry, and so God gives them manna and quail, and they get to Mount Sinai in chapter 19, and then they're there for the rest of the book. So chapter 19 to 40, they're there at Sinai. Moses is getting the law. What happens while Moses is up for 40 days on the top of Mount Sinai?
The golden calf just comes out of the fire.
Yeah, they build the golden calf. It just comes out of the fire, Aaron says. But then after that, they build the tabernacle. When the tabernacle is complete, God shows his approval of the tabernacle, which is, as the book of Hebrews says, a copy of the tabernacle that's in heaven. And so he looks down upon the tabernacle. Moses looks over, examines the work, and God approves and sends his spirit. Cloud fills the tabernacle, and God's people have this message that tabernacle is the way God wants us to worship, because God saw it and he approved it and he filled it at the end of the book. Okay, so on to now some more stuff about Exodus. Thank you. So the purpose of the book. So it's always important when to understand a book to understand why it was written. God could have given all the books of the Bible to Adam and said, read this and don't bother me anymore. But instead, all the 66 books of the Bible are written at these different times through different authors. So starting in, like 1450 BC, that's Moses at Mount Sinai, 1450 BC. So that's Genesis, first book. And then we've got Revelation in, what's a good date for Revelation that we like?
95.
95. Yeah, so AD 95. So we've got, about 1,550 years of writing. And so why does God write a new book of the Bible?
Because his people have a hard time understanding something he previously said.
Yeah, that's right. God could have said, Jesus said the whole all the law and the prophets hang on what? What did Jesus say? Two things that all the law and the prophets, in other words, the whole Bible hangs on these two things, these two commandments.
Love God, love neighbor.
There you go. Love God and love neighbor. So, if we were wise enough, hear this and be humble. If we were wise enough, God could have just said to Adam and Eve, love me and love your neighbor, and we would have gotten it. And he wouldn't have needed to written much of anything. All the Bible is essentially God giving to his people at various times in history specific ways that they were needing to love him and love their neighbor, typically in ways that they were getting it wrong at the current time. And so he writes them a book through a human author to guide them in loving him and loving their neighbor in their day and their particular circumstances. And if you get that idea in your head as you're looking at Scripture, you solve a ton of, when you're reading the Bible and say, I wonder what this means.
For me.
Yeah. If you say, I wonder what this means for me, you're in trouble. You'll get there eventually. But you want to say, I wonder why God wrote this to the people he wrote it to, who are not me. You get that? What am I saying there?
You're not the original audience.
Yeah. The book of Exodus was not written to me. And it was not written to you. Okay, what do I mean? What am I saying there?
You're just making factual statements, and I don't need to. Well, I mean,
It had a purpose
I-
and an occasion for which it was written, and a specific audience for those.
Okay, and what am I saying that the book of Exodus was not written to me?
Moses didn't write it to us.
Moses didn't know me. He didn't care, in fact, that I, had to buy gas this week. Okay? We want to distance ourselves enough so that we're understanding. Oh, Amber Alert. Okay. But can I benefit, and am I called to benefit from Exodus, which is applicable to me? Yes, absolutely. But I'm reading a letter between one person and another, not between someone who wrote a letter to me directly. Okay, so I'm reading a letter between George Washington and John Adams. And I can benefit from that letter. I can understand something about the Constitution. I can understand things about that were true at that time. I might gain some principles about leadership or working with a coworker. All kinds of stuff I can benefit from. But when George Washington says to John Adams, you need to quell the army or something like that, that's not a message to me to go to Fort Benning and tell the army to settle down. Right? That's a misinterpretation of that letter. Because George Washington was not telling John Adams to go to the army of my day and tell them to settle down. It's not written to me. Okay? God was writing the book of Exodus to the people at the end of the 40 years, like we talked about last week. So Exodus has those two places where it says he wandered. Okay, so just let's see. Let me see if I can get it up here. No, not there. Okay, I got it, and then I clicked it forward. There we go. Okay, so two places, there are the references, 1635 and 1438. Moses says in the book of Exodus, so the manna lasted for all 40 years that we traveled in the wilderness. And so we know that the book of Exodus was written at the end of the 40 years. Otherwise, Moses couldn't have said, the manna lasted all 40 years. We were in the book of, or in the wilderness wandering around. And I think that's 4038, or no, that would be 1635. And then 4038, I think is talking about the glory cloud, that it led us around for all 40 years of our journeys, or of our journey. Okay. And so that's another thing we do with our books of Scripture, is that we see what is contained in that book that tips us off to the earliest possible writing date. And so if Moses writes of something that happened in 1410, at the end of the 40 years of wandering, where he makes a summary statement that the manna lasted us all 40 years, then we know he didn't write it before the 40 years are over. Otherwise, he wouldn't have known that the manna had lasted them, past tense, all 40 years. Okay? Let me get us through here. Let's see. No, there we go. Okay. Okay, Matthew, you had a question.
I reasoned it out.
Okay. All right.
I have a question.
Yeah, Bill.
You're saying, on the one hand, that the Bible was written for a specific audience at a specific time.
Yeah.
We, in this age, we like to say that we live our lives by the Bible. Can you help me with the balance
Yeah.
here? If I live my life by the Bible, by God's Word,
Yeah.
how do I do that?
Okay, great. So I'm on the Supreme Court today. Let's pretend. And I want to find out how to do a ruling today for a case that's before me. So what do I look at, Matthew?
Well, you look at the facts of the case, you analyze them, and then you see if they can be applied to your current situation. If in fact they can, the rule of law can then be applied to this situation.
Okay, what do Supreme Court justices do?
Look at precedents.
Look at precedents. Yes. Okay, so you look at a precedent. You say, how was there a similar principle that was applied before to a similar case? Therefore, I need to go by the precedent that's been established to apply to my current day. And so what we do when we look at the Bible is we say, what was the message for them? That's our first step. What was the message to them for them? So like now we're looking at the Gospel of John, and you hear that from me once or twice a sermon. So what did this mean for Jews who were sitting around in 90 AD and all their relatives had not believed in Jesus and they were being persecuted for it? And that's the message John is writing to his original readers. But we say, then how does that apply to me? Well, maybe I'm the only Christian in my family. And all my family thinks I'm nuts, and they make fun of me at Thanksgiving. Okay, see how that's an application. It's right up the stream of the meaning to the original audience. How do you behave? Should I just become like my relatives because it's too hard? Is there good reason to not become like my relatives and to pursue on and to endure in my faith that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, even though my Jewish relatives and friends are mocking me and persecuting me because they say, Jesus is not the Christ. We crucified him, the Pharisees declared. They said, thumbs down, he's not the Christ. He's not the king. Okay? Or do I go on and pursue believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God? And so John answers that over and over through the whole book. And so, does that help, Bill?
So we learn principles and examples.
Yeah. And
try to live our lives by such principles and examples.
Yeah. Yep. So that's a pretty good summary, Bill. Yeah. We bring it forward, and the main thing we're doing as we bring it forward is we see what are connection points, commonalities between the situation of the original audience and my situation today. And that can become very specific. Like, my workplace at this, wherever I work, right? And perhaps my coworkers are making fun of me because of my faith in Jesus. And so that can be very specific for us. But yet it's grounded in this principle that John was written to people who were being ostracized by those who used to be their friends and who are still their relatives, but are badgering them and saying, maybe they're a lot of the Jews to whom John was writing probably had parents who had cut them off for their infidelity to the Jewish faith, because they didn't see Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, the King. So some people today, there's another one. Some people today, if you're coming from a Jewish background or a Catholic background and you come into a church like this, a Protestant Bible-believing church, or if it's a deal like, I forget what I was going to say with that, but that's very much applicable. How do I deal with this? And one of the things we do in doing that, last little part of this, the New Testament gives us so many examples of how we apply the Old Testament to today. And it all comes to us today through Jesus and the gospel. So think of the book of Hebrews. And Hebrews makes the case the ceremonial law applies to today. But here's how it applies. We don't take animal sacrifices to the temple in Jerusalem. Jesus is our sacrifice, and he's gone to the tabernacle in heaven. And it's done, and it's a one sacrifice for all time. So the book of Leviticus applies to us. But it applies to us through the way the New Testament says it applies to us. It applies to us through Jesus, who is sacrifice and priest, and who enters into the Holy of Holies, not with the blood of goats and bulls. We were just reading this last night, Betsy and Mallory and I, but with his own blood. And he didn't have to offer a sacrifice first for his own sins, like the high priest would have to do, and then a second sacrifice for the sins of the people. He just had one sacrifice, and it was just for the sins of the people because he had no sin. He was a perfect high priest. Okay, so that's what's going on in the mind of your pastor every time I look at Scripture. But with all your sermons are that. It's coming from, what did this mean to the original audience? So I just taught hermeneutics, which is the fancy word for interpretation. Hermes is the Greek god of the messenger god. So hermeneutics is messenger or message. But the first thing you do in producing a sermon, and if you don't, you're going to mispreach the text, you preach a sermon to the original audience. And you come up with sermon points to the original audience. That is, I'm saying, what was John? What were his sermon points to the people who were reading his book first? And then I say, okay, you guys aren't Jews who have been disowned by your Jewish families in AD 90 with a Roman government over you. But what are our connection points here? And then I convert that sermon from a sermon to the original audience to a sermon to people who are living today in the United States in our particular culture. Okay. So does that make sense? Yeah. It's kind of a weird thing thinking of, and it was kind of, first year of seminary. We're getting that through our heads, that this is not a book written to me. This is a book written for my benefit that was written to other people. And I'm reading letters that were written to other people that God preserved so that I could read them and benefit from them and apply those things to my life. But the modern and very understandable mistake, and not a thing of sin, is just to say, these are God's love letters to me. God's writing to me, directly. And so, I lucky dip and I go, whoop. What does God want me to do today? And I read the angel's words to Joseph, yes. And it says, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife. And so if it's written to me, I go find a Mary and I take her home and I say, you're my wife now. Okay? I'm just making the principle ridiculous so that you can, we can see that. Mary. And so we don't do that. We say, what does this mean for me, given that this was an angel speaking to Joseph, and that Matthew was writing 49 years later, probably to the church at Antioch. Okay, purpose of the book. Book of Exodus. Let's see, Manny, could you read this? No.
Yeah, not me.
Jeff, can you read this? Jeff just got glasses today or this week, and so he said, now I'll be able to read the board.
God's reason for writing this book at this time, to convince the second generation of Israelites, those under 20 at the time of the 12 spies of Numbers 13 through 14, to follow the covenant order, the laws, the worship regulations set forth by Moses, and not to stray from it just because Moses would not be with him in the promised land.
Okay, thank you. So as we look at this purpose statement, we're taking into account the writing date. Okay, now what's our writing date? What's going on when Moses is writing Exodus, and what's already happened when Moses is writing Exodus?
They're in the wilderness.
Okay, remember those two verses I showed you from Exodus? Reference at the bottom of the slide we were on before this slide.
They're about to go into the promised land?
They're about to go into the promised land. The 40 years are over. Okay, so Moses is writing the book of Exodus when the 40 years are over. Okay, now does Moses go into the promised land? No, he doesn't. He doesn't go into the promised land. So he's writing this. These are, among his last words. He's been told he can't go into the promised land, and he knows he's going to die soon, and so he's writing this. So who's he writing to? Describe the original audience. What are they about to do? Let me ask that. The original audience, what's in front of them?
The promised land.
Yeah, the promised land, Canaan. What will they need to do to inherit the promised land?
Go in.
Wipe out the Canaanites.
Yeah, wipe out the Canaanites. Would you be afraid?
Yeah.
Yeah. This group, were they soldiers?
No.
No, they weren't soldiers.
They weren't even slaves.
They had recently fought up at Og and Sihon, the land that later becomes the east of the Jordan land. But they were about to enter into the promised land, and in this book, Exodus, you have what famous 10 things?
Commandments.
Yeah, the 10 Commandments are there. So Exodus 20 there. And then you have all these other laws there in Exodus. You've got instructions for building something. What were they instructed to build? The tabernacle. Then you got a long section about the building so you have instructions, and then you have almost a virtual repetition of that, and then they did this, and they built 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 this exactly like the instructions said. And then you get chapter 40 there, where it's all done and all completed. So Moses is writing to this group that's about to go into the promised land. Now, the law is prominent in Exodus, and first part of the law, first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments, say the people are to do what or not to do what?
Only worship God, don't worship other gods.
Yeah, only worship God, don't worship him by idols, don't worship other gods. Is there an example in the book of Exodus of when the people disobeyed this? Yeah, golden calf. And so chapter 32, so 10 Commandments is chapter 20. Chapter 32 is the golden calf. Moses has gone back up on the mountain, and he's there for 40 days, getting all these instructions about the tabernacle and such. And so Moses is about to die. You see here, that's actual photograph. Looking over at the promised land from Mount Nebo. Mount Nebo was across the Jordan, and so he could get up there, and God said, you can go up there and look at the promised land, but you won't be able to go into it. But the people there are going to go into the promised land without Moses. Moses has been rebelled against. At one point he says, he cries out to the Lord, he says, these 10 times your people have rebelled, against me. And you put me in this position. And Moses has said several times, I don't want to be the leader. But God says, no, it's you. So there's a temptation for the people going into the promised land to abandon the laws of Moses, abandon the temple worship or tabernacle worship, and to say, oh, that old guy, he was always rebuking us. And he's dead now. Let's do our new thing. This is a living document. But God is a strict constitutionalist, and he says, no, I meant what I said. And so we don't change the law of God because we're in a new place. the moral law of God is set in my character. And so you don't change the moral law of God because my character doesn't change. So stick with this. And these things that I wrote to you and communicated to you during this time in the wilderness are things for the promised land and not to be abandoned when you get into the promised land. So if the people had gotten into the promised land and they had abandoned tabernacle worship, what do you think would have happened?
Trouble.
Curses, trouble, yeah. Like golden calf. That's an illustration that Moses gives there. Something that happened, but something that he brings up as he's writing at the end of the 40 years. This is what will happen if you have high places and idols in the promised land. Okay? God will come down and he'll severely discipline you, and curses will come upon you. And so that's a lesson. It's not just a report of something that happened at Mount Sinai for us today to know. So Cecil DeMille can make a great movie, 10 Commandments. That's something that Moses was using to teach the youngins who are going into the promised land. Don't build idols. Don't worship other gods. Worship the Lord exactly as he has prescribed. If you do, he'll bless you. But if you go after other gods, you will receive his curses, his discipline there. You'll still be his people, but he's a loving father, Hebrews 12, who disciplines. Loving fathers discipline their children. And so just save yourself some time, Moses is saying in the book of Exodus. Save yourself. You can obey the Lord now or you can obey the Lord later. But if you obey him later, you're going to go through a whole bunch of trouble first to learn it. Yeah, Manny.
What's the principle in taking over Canaan for us, right? Because I don't think it's like go move into another country and wipe everyone out.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. So, some of you have heard this before. Richard Pratt used to say this, that now, if you know this first word, you get bonus points. We all had to look at what's that. That's like facade, and so it means simplistic. So facile imitation leads to, it rhymes with imitation. Yeah, there you go. Misinterpretation. So if we think the Bible is written to us directly, then we go into Canada and take it over. All right?
Sounds like Canaan.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's see that? Boy, you could sell some books.
Sell some books and sell your soul.
But facile imitation is the idea of simplistic imitation of stuff we see in Scripture. So that would be like crossing over into Canada or into Mexico and taking over and wiping out all the people completely. Okay, and taking over their wells we didn't dig and their vineyards we didn't plant. Okay. So as we go to the book of Exodus, we say, what are our connection points? Well, we've got some connection points. Canaan, geography's out because Jesus is king over every
kingdom, people.
That's
nation.
Kuiper. What's the Bible?
Every kingdom, people, nation, and tongue. And
Yeah,
tribe.
every tribe, tongue, and nation. You have a king who reigns from heaven over people of all nations. So geography's out. So that's not a connection point for us when we look at the conquest of the land. Getting a little bit into Joshua here, but we're heading toward that. But there is a promised land. Think about the promised land back in the Old Testament. Who lived in it? not now at the days of Moses, but eventually under David, who lived in the Promised Land.
The Israelites.
Yeah, the Israelites. Anyone else?
Not anyone that didn't follow God.
Not anyone, unless they vowed not to worship their other gods while they were there. That was not permitted in the Promised Land. So Promised Land existence still exists today. There is a place we are today. Okay, we're making a connection point. We're making a commonality. Promised Land exists today, sometimes, for us. When are we in a place where all our neighbors are believers in the one true God? Right now, we are in the Promised Land. This is the Old Testament imagery. You can be in a place where all your neighbors, there's no dispute among everyone who's there, who is God. And so, a non-believer can come in to our assembly here, but we don't give them the floor and say, "Hey, what do you think God's like?" Or "How is she?" We don't do that. With folks, this speaks. The Bible from the pulpit speaks. Because God says, no, this is the Promised Land. Where is outside of the borders of the Promised Land today?
Out in the world.
Out in the world. Okay. Now, we have a literal Promised Land on Sunday mornings all over the world. We're literally and physically. All your neighbors, if you're in a church that believes the Bible, all your neighbors are not disputing who is the one true God. You may have some people there who are questioning it, but they're not leading the service. But then out during the week, you're still a member of the Promised Land. You've just gone on a trip to Egypt to get some tea. But you're coming back to the Promised Land on Sunday. Okay, so you see that shadow of Old Testament. And so when we're to answer your question, Manny, when Joshua goes in with the troops and God says, "This is my land and I've given it to Abraham and it is holy and set apart for the worship of me." The world can do whatever. They can worship their false gods. They'll give an account for it in the end. But they can't do that in this land. And so you need to wipe out all unholiness, everything that is not consecrated to me in this land, the Promised Land. And so when Joshua goes in with the people and they wipe out everyone and send them fleeing, so the land is just completely clean of those who don't claim the one true God. Now, what if somebody in the Promised Land, a Canaanite, says, "I believe your God is the real God"? What do?
Take them in.
Take them in. Who's our example?
Rahab.
Okay? So she becomes an Israelite. She says, "I have no dispute with your God. In fact, I think he's the real deal." And so she's brought into Israel. And so today, let me just give you a short answer. Excommunication. Excommunication is where you have somebody in the church who says, God is not God. I don't believe that Jesus is God, and I will fight against that, and I'll speak to people about that and convince them the other way. That's a Canaanite in the land. And so excommunication, we don't physically kill somebody, but we don't have them have membership in the Promised Land community, in the covenant community that lives in the Promised Land. Meanwhile, we as the church, Promised Land members, are wanting the nations to stream to Jerusalem. What do we call that in New Testament language? The Great Commission. What's our Jerusalem that we want nations to stream to? Defined by the New Testament. What's our Jerusalem?
Heaven.
The heavenly Jerusalem, which the writer of Hebrews specifically tells us in Hebrews chapter 12. We have come to the Jerusalem above. He tells us there, we no longer go to physical Jerusalem. So all the Zionists today are off. right? Because the Hebrews 12 has told us, we go, Christians, by their faith in Jesus, have come to the heavenly Jerusalem where our King sits. And so it's a spiritual kingdom. And so when we're out during the week, we're out amongst the world, but we're still members and citizens of what place? Philippians 3:20. Citizens of heaven, where our King sits. What's our capital city as Christians? The heavenly Jerusalem, where our King sits and rules over all of us. And so our lives, we are members of this kingdom, and we're inviting others to become citizens of heaven, citizens of our King, Jesus. And that's the spread of the gospel there. So those two ways, the promised land and then conquering the promised land acts. And so the Great Commission is filling out the borders of the promised land. Okay, so inheriting so making sure all proper inheritance is received. Okay, the promised land was the inheritance of Israel. Okay, and so the task of Joshua was to get everybody into their inheritance, into their plot of land. And the Great Commission is making sure all the elect heirs who don't have faith yet, we're making sure they get faith by preaching the gospel to them. Because there's an inheritance for them. There's a plot of land, so to speak, an inheritance in heaven for them that God has for them that they haven't walked into yet. And that's Joshua language, right? They're filling out the borders, starting from just north of the Dead Sea. And they go in and they fill out the borders and they conquer all the promised land. So that's how that works there. Great question there, Manny. So that's what we're dealing with Moses and the promised land. And he's getting the people in the book of Exodus to not abandon the things that were set forth at Sinai. In fact, those things set forth at Sinai were the things that would keep them in blessing when they inherited the promised land. After all the battle was done with Joshua, if they obeyed the laws and the order that Moses had set, worship order, how you live your life order, moral law, all that's in Exodus, if you live by that, you'll experience this land flowing with milk and honey, and God's blessing to the full. Does that make sense? Okay. Deacons, we do have a young couple here with a child. Yeah. They just came in. They're just waiting for the service.